In 1980, as a follow-up to his landmark film Dawn of the Dead, George A. Romero made Night Riders, an intimate epic about a traveling group of Renaissance fair reenactors that held jousting tournaments atop motorcycles. Man, what was going on in the 70s? It's notable not just for being an excellent film in its own right, but due to the group of people behind and in front of the camera. In particular, this seemingly innocuous scene would be a portent of things to come, and a moment when two masters of the horror genre came together. By 1978, George A. Romero had already been a successful director of commercials, industrial films, and even shorts for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Oh, and he also single-handedly created the zombie genre with Night of the Living Dead and its sequel. Stephen King had been an industrial laundry worker, teacher, and author of dozens of short stories, and a novel-turned-film that scared the hell out of audiences. Brought together initially by an abortive attempt at filming Salem's Lot as a feature, King and Romero hit it off, and wanting to work together, they chose King's novel The Stand to adapt, with King writing and Romero directing. But with the book's massive scale and potentially massive budget as a stumbling block, they decided to make a smaller, more intimate, original film as a test run. The format they chose is one that's been with cinema since nearly its inception, the Horror Anthology. For nearly a century, horror anthologies have been a genre mainstay, some great, some good, some not worth mentioning. But as good or bad as any particular one might be, the central problem in presenting the individual tales has always been the wraparound segment. Most anthologies use the simple method of several strangers thrown together and telling stories, and in the end, they're in hell. King and Romero's solution to the problem was ingenious, sidestepping it while allowing them to pay homage to a shared childhood obsession. Post-war America was a boom time, not just in population and prosperity, but in popular culture as well. Although the battle against milquetoast conformity would prove slow-going in mainstream media, a revolution was exploding within city and suburb in the most unlikely and at first unnoticed of places. For decades, comic books had been predominantly tales of adventure, comedy, and most of all, superheroes. But in the years after the war, they took a decidedly more sinister turn. Tales of the grisly and macabre proliferated, typified by the works of EC comics like Tales from the Crypt and crime suspense stories. Horror comics became all the rage. At their height, dozens of titles yielded close to 1,000 issues of deviance and depravity. It seemed there'd be no end. Until this man, Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver, held hearings in Washington about the effects of horror comics on juvenile delinquency. Soon after, the Comics Code Authority was introduced, and horror comics all but vanished from the scene. Creepshow begins with a scene that should be familiar to many children of the 50s. A typical suburban dad throwing a fit over his son's comic book choice, resulting in an egregious punishment. The dad is played by Tom Atkins, a familiar face to fans of John Carpenter, and his son Billy is future best-selling author Joe Hill. Oh yeah, Joe Hill is a pen name. His actual name is Joe King, but then you knew that. Having their anthology of tales come to life straight from the pages of the comic is the bit of ingenuity I mentioned earlier. It also allows Romero to frame scenes and transitions throughout the film in neat comic book style. The first fear fable presented is Father's Day. It tells the tale of the Granthams, a wretched old-money New England family, and the awful means through which they've received their inheritance. They're engaged in their annual Father's Day get-together to pay tribute to their Aunt Bedelia, who 7 years earlier finally had enough of their patriarch Nathan, whom she dispatched with a marble ashtray while he was clamoring for his Father's Day cake. Bedelia is played with manic glee by Vivica Lindfors, a Swedish stage and film actress who in 1948 played Queen Margaret opposite Errol Flynn in The Adventures of Don Juan. Rounding out the Grantham clan are stage legend Carrie Nye as Aunt Sylvia, Elizabeth Regan as Cass, and award-winning stage director Warner Shook as Richard. Oh, and Golden Globe winner and perennial Oscar nominee Ed Harris as Cass's rube of a boyfriend Hank. Mr. Harris provides perhaps the film's single greatest scare during this scene dancing to a disco tune with Cass. I hope he never sees this. I think he'll kill me. 7 years moldering in his grave hasn't lessened Nate's lust for that cake, however, and in the fine EC tradition, he's back to get it. The character of Nathan Grantham is played by two actors. John Lormer, seen here in the 1960 TV drama The Rebel, plays the still-breathing Nate. The cake-hungry corpse contains within his maggot-writhing features the form of John Amplas. Amplas is another Romero mainstay who deserves a special mention for his completely underrated performance as the titular character in Romero's vampire opus Martin. He manages to bring to life an awkward, socially inept murderer and make him not just compelling, but sympathetic. Nathan Grantham is a lot less so, but no less compelling, as is Carrie Nye for allowing frosting and lit candles to be perched atop her head for this magnificent climax. While the film claims to be an original screenplay, that's not entirely true. Of the 5 stories presented, 2 were previously published in periodicals. The second tale initially appeared in Cavalier magazine under the title Weeds. By the time it made its way to Creepshow, it was known as The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill. Jordy, played by the author himself, is a farmer living on the outskirts of Castle Rock, Maine, who's experiencing bad luck that's lasted nearly his whole life. His father has recently passed on, his crops are failing, and the bank loan on his property is about to come due. The promise of salvation drops out of the sky, quite literally, in the form of a meteorite, which Jordy hopes he can turn to profit. A promise that seems dashed when the meteorite breaks open and releases a luminescent goo.
Meteor shift!
While each of the stories in Creepshow are shot through with humor, Jordy Verrill is the only straight comedy, with Jordy's fantasies about what college professors and medical doctors look like being a prime example. But it's also the most tragic. The meteorite's liquid seed is a supergrowth formula that transforms all it comes in contact with into lush, virulent vegetable life. That includes the surrounding landscape, a water spigot, a bucket, a Cadillac, and Jordy himself. And those fantasies that are played for laughs are actually quite heartbreaking when you realize that every authoritarian figure in Jordy's imagination is not only overwhelmingly negative, but they all have the face of his deceased father.
Well, that's Verrill luck, all right. Always in, always bad.
The worst. And it won't be getting any better for Jordy. But then there might be some solace in the fact that his luck, and that of everyone else on the planet, is about to even up for all time. From the ridiculous to the equally gruesome comes perhaps my favorite segment of the film. Any piece of fiction can be measured by how interesting its antagonist is. You can have a cipher for a hero, but if the villain is boring, you're doomed. Something to Tide You Over has one of the best villains of all time in Richard Vickers, an insane television executive played by Leslie Nielsen. Now I know, everyone pictures Mr. Nielsen like this.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Or this. But there was a time when he was known as this, and could handily deliver a performance as menacing and lunatic as he does here. At the story's center lies an affair between Richard's wife Becky and Harry Wentworth, played by Ted Danson. The same year as Creepshow, he took on the role of Sam Mayday Malone on a little show set in Boston, and became primarily a comedic actor. So it's a welcome sight that recently he's appeared in shows like Fargo, returning to dramatic roles. Through threat of harm to Becky, Richard convinces Harry to accompany him to a lonely stretch of private beach. At gunpoint, Harry is buried up to his neck in sand before being reunited with Becky, albeit via video. I did mention that Richard is a TV exec. Becky is played by Galen Ross, no stranger to Romero Productions, having played Fran in Dawn of the Dead. Richard leaves both alone with the steadily approaching tide, a manner of revenge once utilized by Blackbeard, though far crueler here, in that Harry can watch as Becky drowns before he suffers the same fate. And Richard has a technological edge on the old pirate. He can enjoy it unfolding from the comfort of his living room, and not just once. He intends to view the death of his wife and her lover over and over again. As I said, what a great villain. But to Richard's shock, Becky and Harry survive. Wait, no, they don't. They die. Horribly. And I should take a moment to point out that there's no visual effect in this shot. That's Ted Danson, sealed in a tank of water from the neck up, illustrating Harry's last moments on Earth. That is commitment to character. With the lovers expired and their bodies washed out to sea, Richard couldn't be happier. If only he knew he was in a horror comic, he wouldn't get too comfortable. Because in this world, even the dead deserve vengeance, and no earthly force can keep them from it. Creepshow's centerpiece is The Crate, a tale of lifelong friendship, collegiate politics, janitorial excellence, and an Antarctic creature that, in between century-long naps, enjoys devouring any and everyone it encounters. More specifically, the story is about Henry Northrop, played by Hal Holbrook, an actor whom I suspect has portrayed Mark Twain longer than even Samuel Clemens. Henry is an aging, mid-level English professor at Horlicks University. His best friend is head of zoology Dexter Stanley, played by Fritz Weaver, seen here in an episode of The Twilight Zone. Henry is married to Wilma.
Oh, just call me Billy, everyone does.
He spends most of his waking life fantasizing about murdering her, a prospect made endlessly appealing thanks to a braying, grating, bravura performance by Adrienne Barbeau. When a clumsy janitor discovers a forgotten crate beneath a stairwell in the university's basement, he enlists Professor Stanley's help to investigate. Incidentally, Mike the janitor is played by Don Kiefer, one of the stars of the original Death of a Salesman from 1951. They gleefully pry it open, hoping to find some bit of forgotten antiquity. Instead, they discover a waking nightmare. There are a lot of stars in Creepshow, but perhaps the biggest remains unseen throughout. That's makeup effects guru Tom Savini. A former combat photographer in Vietnam, Savini had previously handled effects work on Romero's Martin and Dawn of the Dead, and would go on to create the first and later the best iterations of Jason Voorhees from the Friday the 13th series. But in Creepshow, Savini's work on the crate creature, nicknamed Fluffy, is a masterpiece, taking King's barely described monster and turning it into a tangible and terrifying reality. After his disastrous initial contact with the creature, Professor Stanley seeks the help of a grad student, Charlie Garrison, played by Robert Harper. It doesn't go well. leaving him only one option: the rational, level-headed counsel of Henry Northrop. Henry sees the situation as an opportunity, not only to help his friend, but himself. He cleans up the bloody scene in Emerson Hall in a rush to finish before Billy arrives, lured there with a salacious note. It's the best edited sequence of the entire film. The Crate was edited by Paul Hirsch. He's handled the cutting on a couple of noteworthy films over the years: Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Footloose, a host of Brian De Palma's films, and he won an Academy Award for his work on Star Wars. Without giving too much away, I wanted to highlight this scene. Hal Holbrook is brilliant as he tries to contain his glee over what he has planned for Billy.
You're hysterical, Henry. It's just what I would have expected.
No, I don't think you'll expect this, Wilma.
Which brings us to the final fear fable, and it's not for the squeamish. They're Creeping Up on You is nearly a one-man show, starring E.G. Marshall as Upson Pratt, a Howard Hughes-esque billionaire whiling away his life in a hermetically sealed New York apartment. He spends his days harassing underlings and generally squashing everyone in his sphere like insects. Marshall was a wonderful character actor, best known in the 50s for his portrayal of Juror Number 4 in 12 Angry Men. Here, he absolutely shines as a bitter old germaphobe. Say, that soap dish looks familiar, because it's the marble ashtray Aunt Bedelia used to off old Nathan Grantham. Here it is on the professor's desk in Jordy Verrill. It's a bedside ashtray and something to tide you over. And it's on Henry's desk in the Crate. Pratt is celebrating his latest hostile takeover, though more specifically, he's reveling in the suicide of a rival whose career he's just destroyed. But damned if he can't enjoy himself, because no matter how much he sprays, steps on, or crushes, he just can't keep the insects from invading his ivory tower. And when a citywide blackout descends like the wrath of God, he learns that as much as he hates bugs, they despise him tenfold. Or is it a million? When the power is restored, everything reverts to its sterile perfection. Maybe there were never any bugs at all. Maybe they were all in his mind. Maybe not. Creepshow was released on November 12, 1982, and it yielded not only this phenomenal poster by Jack Kamen, a veteran artist of EC Comics, but also its own comic adaptation. The Creepshow comic was drawn by the late, great Bernie Wrightson, whose artwork is easily some of the best of the 20th century. I wholeheartedly suggest you seek him out. You won't be disappointed. Creepshow earned $21 million in the US alone, nearly triple its budget. Critics were unkind, and it never yielded the adaptation of The Stand, but that's entirely irrelevant. The film is a perfect ode to horror, comics, and horror comics. It is, as the advertising would proclaim,
the most fun you'll ever have being scared.